to the North East and Moray. Today's evidence session is comprised of two panels, and for the first panel I welcome Mike Duncan, North East Scotland Development Manager for FSB North East Scotland, and Jordan Jack, General Secretary of the Campaign for North East Rail. We have received apologies from Duncan Cameron, Managing Director for First Bus, who has had to take part in other urgent business. Okay, so we'll come to questions this morning. If I would start, and I'll come to Mike first.
A specific survey, it was industry-wide. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Jordan, if I come to you, who you're here representing the campaign for rail, so you could argue you're a campaign that is focused on delivering a just transition, but do you think there's a shared understanding of what a just transition means for the area, and how will we know if we've achieved it?
It's quite difficult. We attended a meeting with the Just Transition Lab in University of Aberdeen just last week, and they've been working on, and they're about to publish a piece of work that looks at exactly that, measuring the just transition and trying to work out exactly how we quantify that. And as a campaign, we've always leaned heavily on evidence, and rather than just shouting that we want this done, we really want to have evidence to back us up and to be the arbiter to say, here's what the people that do the work are saying. So a big piece of that work was collating and trying to understand people's understandings of the just transition and how we measure it going forward. That piece is due in December, and I'd really urge the committee to look into that when it's published, because it's a really solid piece of work, and we were thoroughly impressed with the work that's been done at the university.
And then Mike said that there's a feeling among his members that it's something that's happening in Aberdeen, that it's about the oil and gas sector. Do you find that's a challenge for you in trying to link the campaign into the broader activity that needs to happen to deliver a just transition?
As a campaign, we are looking at the just transition as a longer term thing, and it's less about how individual businesses are changing. We're looking less at how, say, a business changes from an oil heating system to an electric heating system. We're looking at, are these businesses going to be able to hold on in the area, and are we going to have the wider industrial base to support these smaller businesses? For example, if we're looking at over the long term, a reduction in oil and gas and an increase in renewables to match that, we need to hold on to that skilled staff. For us as a campaign, it's about looking at that from a local perspective. There's a competition between the city and the Shire when it comes to attracting this investment, and also intra-Shire, North Aberdeenshire, Fraserburgh and Peterhead, compared with Montrose and Arbroath and ports like that. So we've got to think, as this investment comes in, are we increasing the people that are commuting? Are we fundamentally changing the makeup of where people's jobs are and where they're commuting to and from, and how is that going to affect the region as a whole?
Okay, thank you. I'll now bring in Maggie Chapman to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thanks very much, Claire. Good morning to the panel. Thank you for being with us this morning. I've got a few questions around infrastructure and supply chains and transport. So, Mike, if I can start with you.
Opportunities going forward.
Okay, thank you. Jordan, if I can come to you now, and you here for the campaign for North East Rail, and obviously transport is, I think all of us understand the importance of transport for the just transition. Can you just outline some of the reasons why you think prioritising public transport is so crucial, not only for Scotland's ambitions in this space, but particularly for the north of the North East?
Yeah, so transport's often thought of as this kind of field of its own, kind of siloed off, and to be its own thing, and as if it doesn't interact with other things. But really, transport is the foundation upon which we build our lives. It's interwoven into every decision that we make. Our sense of place comes from where we live, and where we live often comes from where we work. And that is intimately linked with transport. I can give you a concrete example of that. Two multi-million-pound international companies were founded in Fraserburgh. Brewdog's one of them, and the second one is Power Jacks, who make jack screws for aircraft and ships and things like that. Both of them felt that as they were growing, to achieve the growth that they needed, they moved out of Fraserburgh and to Ellen. Ellen's only 10 miles down the road. The difference is Ellen's got a dual carriageway connection, Fraserburgh doesn't. So I'm not saying that transport is the sole reason that happened, but it's certainly a huge part of it. And when we look at what these companies were saying publicly, it was both that they struggled to attract investment where they were, and they also struggled to keep and attract skilled staff to the area. So people are looking at, in layman's terms, they're looking at the area and thinking, oh, it's too far away. It's the absolute rurality of the area, but it's also the perceived ruralness of the area and how far away it feels to people that's making a decision. And I just find it astonishing that such huge growth can be achieved with just moving 10 miles down the road. It's not like they've moved to closer to Edinburgh or to the Central Belt. They've just moved to Ellen. So transport has enormous implications for our lives, and it can deliver so much for us as well. When we think about this rurality and perceived sense of remoteness, rail can deliver regeneration. We look at the headlines that's come out of the Borders. The head of the Borders Council a couple of years after it opened said that the railway had breathed new life into communities that were declining. Just last week, we had another headline come out of the Borders, said that a valley community had been completely revived. And spoilers, but just tomorrow or the next day there's an article coming out in the P&J about the 3-year anniversary of Kintour opening. And again, there's interviews with small businesses in there who have all said that the railway has made an enormous difference to their trade, and we've seen the population of the town increase, and we've seen that town thrive, whereas before it was maybe a satellite town to Inverurie. It's now thriving on its own thing. So transport is much more than just what it is, and it like I said, it underpins everything we do. And when we think about housing, when we think about employment, transport is intimately linked in that conversation.
Okay, thanks. And I mean, I suppose you mentioned some of the successes that other reopenings or new rail routes had. Could you just... We're thinking about the just transition. We're thinking about the shift away from a fossil fuel-based economy. So there are benefits, obviously, to businesses, and you've outlined some of them. What is it specific about rail that's so important?
Rail is important because it's a separate secondary line. So it delivers segregation. So what rail can achieve is modal shift. So when we've got in the example north of Ellen to Fraserburgh and Peterhead, we've got the two largest towns in Fraser, the first and the third largest towns in Aberdeenshire, and a single carriageway road that's shared with enormous amounts of freight, road freight, because there's no other option. It's shared with buses, which get delayed with cars. It's shared with drivers, and it's shared with people that have to drive, and taxis as well. So everyone has only got one option if we've not got a railway. If we introduce a railway, we can shift the freight that can go on the rail to the railway, things that can go in containers onto the railway. That relieves the roads. We can shift an enormous amount of the cars onto the railway, again relieving the roads, and that increases capacity on the road network, which gives you better buses. It reduces the frustration of drivers being held behind slow lorries, which reduces accidents, and it delivers the thing that we hear from business constantly is predictability and reliability of transport. So when there was a study done in 2016 into reopening the historic line the historic for Martin and Buchan line. And one of the things that was raised there, I can quote it directly, is Fraserburgh and Peterhead ports are key generators of freight for oil and gas and subsea, so increasingly renewable industries where vessels only have a limited time at berth. Slack must be built into freight movements, leading to inefficiencies and higher costs for these businesses, which reduces their competitive nature when compared to ports such as Aberdeen and Montrose. So again, I'm talking about this competition within the region, and rail. By introducing rail, it can. The modal shift is the thing that we're looking at, moving things off of the road and onto rail.
And that,
Ms Chapman, can I make some progress? And there's time, I'll bring you in at the end. Is that okay? So Kevin Stewart to be followed by Brian.
Thank you, Convener. If I could turn first of all to Mr. Jack, and I'm going to go a bit back into history. Obviously, investment in rail is pretty costly. I think it would be fair to say, and often the assessments that are done that lead up to new rail projects, they can be quite onerous, can they not? And you're embarking on some of that work at this moment in time. If we go back to the expected patronage of Lawrence Kirk Station, let's take that one as an example. It transpired that once that station was open, that patronage was 77%, if I remember rightly, greater than had been envisaged in any of the assessments. I would argue that that was partly because a bigger car park was put in place than was originally envisaged as well. We've also seen increased patronage from changes to timetabling in the North East. I think, if I remember rightly, after the timetable changes between Inverurie and Stonehaven, patronage at Inverurie increased by 80%. Do you think, Mr. Jack, that there is the patronage levels on that for Martin Buchan route to justify the reopening of that railway?
Absolutely. When we compare the railways, let's look at the Borders railway. When we compare the line Aberdeen to Peterhead, Dice to Peterhead, and to the Borders to Tweedbank, as it was. If we think back, looking at history, to the Borders Railway, there was a certain opposition to extending the Borders Railway as far as Tweedbank.
There was a lot of opposition.
And it was thought that the stations in Edinburgh and close to Edinburgh would be the only ones that would justify themselves economically. But actually that's what the studies showed, and that's what the consultants showed. But actually, when the line opened and we got the Year 1 review in and we got the Year 2 review in, we saw a wholesale underestimation of patronage on the entire line. But when we look into that data more granularly, we actually saw that it was the stations that were furthest away from Edinburgh that outperformed, that massively outperformed, and the stations closest to Edinburgh actually underperformed their expectations. And the difference in Peterhead and Peterhead, let's just compare apples with apples. This line to Peterhead is within half a mile of the length of the line to Tweedbank. Now, we are proposing another 20 miles to Fraserburgh as well. There's no getting away from the fact that this would be the longest railway reopening in Scotland at 50 miles-ish. But just to compare the 30 with the 30 on the Peterhead branch, the population is roughly 80 to 85% of the border, so it is less. The length is, like I said, almost exactly the same. But when you look at the distribution, the largest population is in Peterhead, right at the end of the line. The second largest population is in Ellen, more than half of the way there. So if we think about the borders and how the stations that were furthest away outperformed, and I'm speaking 800%, 1200%, for example, for Tweedbank and 800% for Galashiels. compared to the stations closest, that's going to more than make up for the 15% drop in population compared to the regions.
So that modal shift, do you think, is important? The railway is important to gain that modal shift. Again, I'm going to go back into history because obviously it's been a fair amount of time since Formartine and Buchan closed. But it closed to passengers before it closed to freight.
Correct.
And if my memory serves me well in terms of history, it wasn't until around about the mid-80s that the freight aspects from Fraserburgh south actually ceased operation. Now, you talked about two companies, Brewdog, Powerjacks. I'm sure that all of the committee are aware of these companies, making that move just a wee bit south in order to get the linkages. Do you think if a freight operation had continued to, a rail freight operation had continued to exist, that those companies might have stayed in Fraserburgh because it would have been easier for them to ship their goods?
I don't want to second guess these companies. I'm not sitting on the boards of these companies, but I think the answer, from my perspective, is quite an obvious yes, because the transport problems that has been raised in the 2016 study, which was just to get this on the table, the findings of the 2016 study were actually re-evaluated by Nestrans in 2022 in an evidence review, and they were found to largely still be the problems that were identified in 2016 were still relevant in 2022. So when I speak of the 2016 study, that is up to date as can be. But that problems were unreliability of freight, having to build in slack because of the shared road space, and the frequency of accidents and the knock-on effects that causes. So if they were shipping by rail, they wouldn't have to deal with them problems, and they would also benefit from the long connection, the connections to the entire UK rail network. So they would get down to their processing plants, their distribution plants, the Central Belt, but they could also continue the trains on and across to the continent as well.
So one of the other things that the committee has heard a lot about is increasing capacity and modernising our ports and harbours in order to maximise the opportunity that renewables, offshore renewables, can give us. And obviously, certainly Fraserburgh have got a plan. Fraserburgh Port have got a plan at this moment, a pretty ambitious plan in terms of expansion. Peterhead always has plans. We have seen the opening of South Harbour at Aberdeen. What part do you see a rail playing in terms of the transportation of goods to these ports? And how much of the study that you are undertaking is looking at freight and not just passenger movements?
So I'll answer it in reverse. The study itself, freight is, we've just last week had to reiterate this, we had to, but we reiterated this as to the consultant in a meeting, that freight is as integral to the study as passengers, because we're aiming for that modal shift. The focus of our study is achieving the benefits that we saw in the borders, and adding to that by the freight element, because there's one thing that the borders saw all these benefits, but they never actually achieved the shipment of freight that they wanted. A lot of that is lessons learned to the borders. A lot of that is lessons learned from leaving and trying to get Diageo on board. But freight is an integral part of it, and like I said, it's chasing modal shift. If we can't get these HGVs off of the single carriageway roads, we're not going to solve the problems of the areas that were identified in 2016 and reiterated in 2022. So, what role do I see it playing? We're not naive enough to think that we're going to see wind turbine blade on the back of a train anytime soon, especially through the tunnels in Aberdeen. That's just not going to happen. But what we can do is we can look at the businesses that are suitable for rail. So to be suitable for rail, it needs to be heavy or bulky, it needs to fit in a container, and it needs to be regular and ideally long distance as well. And in the North East, we've got a wealth of businesses that meet them criteria. Brewdog is one. They're shipping cans. They can ship empty cans up. They can ship full cans back. Same as the success we've seen in the Highland Freight, Highland Spring in Perthshire. We've also got Mackey's do ice cream. We've got the exact same thing. So food products. We've got Gray and Adams, who build HGV trailers. We're not going to get the entire HGV trailer on, but they take prefabricated parts like axles, like steering assemblies, like big chunky parts for to go onto HGV trailers. They come all the way up from Leicester. And ASCO ship things between the ports, but a lot of that won't fit on freight on rail, but a lot of it just goes into a container on the back of a lorry and away. So there's a huge opportunity there. Another opportunity we see is the Acorn project, which was a bit of political football for a while, but we now see that that's progressing. So the Acorn project is a carbon capture storage project in St Fergus between Fraserburgh and Peterhead. A lot of the CO2 is going to be pumped up from Grangemouth directly in a reversed pipeline, but they also plan for a lot of it to come up from all over the UK to Peterhead Port and then onto the back of a lorry and driven from Peterhead Port to St Fergus. So we see an opportunity there to cut out the middleman and put a rail link in directly into St Fergus, and we can see these CO2 wagons come up from anywhere in the UK rail network up to directly up to St Fergus. We're not burning the roads, and when it comes to their long-term ambitions, things like producing hydrogen or even sustainable aviation fuel, we get that two-way traffic as well. We're not at any point in the supply chain are we shipping empty wagons.
Grant, I've got one final, very quick question, convener, and that is around about what work have we done in cooperation between the two of you to see what impact, positive or negative, I suspect it would be positive, on the reopening of railway stations in the North East and beyond, or even those timetabling changes that I've mentioned as well. Has the FSB done any studies in Kintor, for example, about the opening there? Was there any studies done in Lawrence Kirk around about the reopening there? And is that maybe something that your organisations can do in collaboration to see what benefits or any disbenefits there are to reopening stations?
I can assure there will be collaboration from today onwards, and I can also tell you that I've actually used Kintor Station myself to commute into Aberdeen before driving, and you might think about extending the railway to Buckie Harbour as well, which is one you didn't mention about taking advantage of just transition funding. Thank you.
Jordan?
Yeah, so like I said, we work off. We like to work off evidence that is available to us. We didn't like to just as a campaign, because at the end of the day, a campaign is just a group of people. There might be somebody, there might be nobody. So we like to boost the evidence. So for us as a campaign, a lot of our work has been retrospective and working with Nestrans to tease out the information that is there and provide that forward. Going forward, we are raising a bit of funding, so we're looking at funding studies into these things, case studies, and building up that evidence base. But there is a wealth of evidence already out there from the local transport partnerships on, like we're saying, that how often we underestimate the popularity of these stations.
Thank you, convener.
Thank you. Brian Whittle, did you wish a supplementary?
Thank you, convener. Good morning. I'll be brief. I'll ask my question in two parts. The first part to you, Jordan, second part to you, Mike. The Scottish Government has a target of reducing car mileage by 20% by 2030. And I'm interested in the impact currently what we're trying to do is prevent cars coming into city centres. I had my own experience of that in Aberdeen, trying to navigate myself around a couple of weeks ago, having not been in Aberdeen for a while. I wonder if our public transport system has the capability currently to pick up that slack, if you like, of people travelling into and out of our city centres for either for purchases or for work. And secondly, what impact on trade that preventing people being able to come in and out of work will have, or coming out to shop will have on our city centres, our sort of recruitment and retention, and as I said, in terms of turnover for businesses. So initially, to you, Jordan, around, are we is the North East set up to take up that reduction in car?
I would say it's the infrastructure in the North East in terms of public transport when you get out of the city is woefully inadequate. We go back as far as Beechin. The North East was one of the hardest hit areas when we look at what there was compared to what there is. And now we're not a nostalgic campaign at all. We're looking at the needs now and the problems now and the solutions now. But to give an example, I got the train in from Dice today, which is the closest station, to Fraserburgh and Peterhead by mileage. If I was to catch the same train that I caught today, starting at Fraserburgh, using public transport, I would have had to leave 44 minutes earlier from Fraserburgh to get the bus, and 36 minutes earlier from Peterhead to get the bus. That's compared to driving. But when we're speaking about public transport, there's the availability problem and whether you've got the options. Now, a lot of the time we look at stick solutions, and we're looking at things like congestion charges and like that's been taken in Aberdeen, and bus gates and things like that. But we actually need both carrot and stick. Yeah. In our mind as a campaign, we're never going to achieve modal shift, and by modal shift, all I mean is people deciding to leave their car at home and get public transport. The only way people make that decision, and we know ourselves, is if there's a better option than the car. We're only going to leave the car and get something else if that something else is better than driving. So it needs to either be faster, it needs to be more convenient, or it needs to be just better somehow. And sometimes, so that's the availability problem, but sometimes you've got the option, but you can't quite make it work, and that's the first mile, last mile problem. So you might be able to get into, say, the centre of Aberdeen, but you're not going to the centre of Aberdeen. You're going to an industrial estate, or you're going to Altons, or you're going to the New Harbour, for example. So there needs to be this, as Mike said, there needs to be joint up thinking, and we need to start thinking a lot more about integrating our transport system. So often I look at railway timetables and bus timetables, and we see that there's a train, just for example's sake, Aberdeen to Dundee, but there's also a bus leaving within 5 minutes, Aberdeen to Dundee, and it's got the same stops. Now, why is that a thing? When if we should be looking at maybe having the train stopping every so often and being able to get off the train onto a bus directly and connecting there. So we need to look at integrating our transport system, and that's buses, trains to buses, but maybe then to active travel as well, and how do we get not only to city centres but to where we're actually going.
Before Mr Jack here mentioned carrot and stick, I'd written it down myself, and he mentioned convenience, and I'd written that down myself as well. So I back exactly what you're saying. I'm not going to repeat that, but there's no doubt that restricting traffic into town centres has a negative impact on trade. People need to be where they want to be to buy the products they need, the services they want, and there is a kind of change required to get people to think differently, to be willing to park in maybe a satellite town like Kintor we've mentioned before, and get the train into a town centre. But not just in Aberdeen. I'm thinking about our smaller town centres, which are going the same way, not just pedestrianised, but pushing cars out wider at a time when there is no carrot or no available parking roundabout to help people get in to support those small businesses that are in our towns. And to come on to another part of your question about the infrastructure, when I was speaking to a transport and logistics company 2 or 3 weeks ago about changing their vehicles, hydrogen, electric, however they wanted to go, and like the main thing is cost. I can buy a truck for X 100,000 and a hydrogen or electric one will be 400,000, so it's four times the cost. But the second question is infrastructure. It's not, the infrastructure does not exist right now for that logistics transport company to invest in an electric or hydrogen vehicle to make it sustainable for what they do going forward. And it will take a vast amount of quantity of money and time to get that appropriate infrastructure in place.
Where have we heard that before? Aligning bus and rail timetables. I'll leave it there.
Thank you. And it's connected to Brian's question. So the Just Transition Fund is a 10-year fund, and we're in kind of the end of the 2 years. And you've both described, I suppose particularly Jordan, about a kind of inclusive, integrated network, transport system that would support modal shift and that would be available to everybody and would be accessible, which you think would be one of the underpinning reasons for a just transition. Do you feel that these type of conversations are taking place enough in the North East and Moray? Or, Mike, you said it does feel like it's still Aberdeen or it's still oil and gas. And do you think the broader, and who should be leading, do you think the broader discussion is taking place and who should be leading on that and kind of driving that forward, do you think?
I think that, again, I'll make the distinction between Aberdeen City and Shire and Moray. They both have distinctive strategies for dealing with it, but they're not used to the linkages between those two areas unless you go back to the old Grampian region, which was obviously moved away from. So there are plans in place to make it more integrated. I'll maybe just put the dualling of the A96 up there as well. As a possibility, but there's always more work to do, is what I would say, and there's no doubt that an improvement in the infrastructure would help our small business community. It would help customers get to them, and for those businesses that export or have products to get out of the North East, then it would help that as well. I just want to touch on park and ride briefly. It has to be free. No one's going to pay for a park and ride system. So that has to be subsidised, I would say, by the local authority or wherever it might be to make it viable at all.
Mm-hmm. Jordan?
I would add, we often in transport lock ourselves into long-term plans. Now, long-term planning is an absolute must with transport. I'm just going to say that I'm not saying anything different. But we need to review a lot more than we do now. For example, we've got STPR2, which is our transport investment now through to 2040. So that's a 20-year plan. From that, we've got our local regional transport strategy, and now we've got our local transport strategy that's just recently been published, and they're all based off each other down the line. But then, congruent to that, we've got, as you said, the government's 20% reduction in car target by 2030. Now, it's mentioned in all of these documents, but there's no effort to look at each element of that and say, well, how does this contribute to that goal? If we're building a city centre dual carriageway, is that going to get us closer to that goal or further away from that goal? So every time the government takes out a goal or a target, we should be reviewing these documents and saying, well, we've got this plan, is that going to help or is that going to be a detriment? Just to pull some examples for the regional transport strategy, there's a lot of good things in there. There's Aberdeen Rapid Transport, for example, a lot of investment in park and ride and things like that. But we're also building the Berwick End Corridor, which is a city centre dual carriageway, and that's been in the works for a long time. So here you go. Speaking of history. So is that just continued on and been pushed because it's been on the plans, or has that ever been looked at? Well, is that going to help us reach our 20% reduction goals? Now, as a campaign, we're a rail campaign, we're not an anti-road campaign, the merits of the Bed End corridor, we've got different views within the campaign, but that's just a perfect example of is that going to help us towards our 20% reduction goal? I think so, personally.
And in terms of the Just Transition Fund, which is a part of the inquiry, and I think, Mike, you did refer to the fund earlier, because it is the fund that's administered by SNIB, and then we were in Aberdeen and took evidence from local community groups who were applying for the kind of community participative budgeting side of it. Is it a fund that you think is relevant to your members? Because you said you looked at the fund, and it tends to be bigger projects, bigger companies, and then you've got the discrete pot of money that's for local communities, and that, when we met them, it tended to be more voluntary groups, charities who were accessing that money. Is there anything from the funding that's been announced that's And Jordan, do you want, in terms of the Just Transition Fund, you know, we've talked about where the fund is currently focused. Do you think the focus of the fund is correct?
Well, for us as a campaign, we wouldn't be where we are without the Just Transition Fund. And it's maybe for a bit of context, it's important to explain how we got to where we are. The Just Transition Fund was never set up to fund campaigns like ours. We had to do a lot of negotiation, a lot of back and forth with the Aberdeen Grampian Chamber of Commerce to be able to take Just Transition funding, because it's set up for businesses and to do specific projects for things like upgrading boilers and solar panels and XYZ. So for us as a campaign, we have had to get a consultant on board, and the Chamber of Commerce has had to take our money and pass that to consultant in this triangular setup. So it's been quite difficult for us to get that funding. And I think the arguments I'm making today is that transport is so integrally important to the Just Transition itself that I think there should be a way for campaigns like ours to. There should be a separate channel for campaigns to apply for, is what I'm getting at. But it's like I'm saying, all the way down from SBR2 down to the regional transport strategy, we are separate, we are added on. There's nothing to say that we're going to get to the end of the funded portion of our study. We've got 2/3 funded so far. Even if it's successful, there's nothing to say that we're going to get the funding to continue. So we're hoping, we're certainly going to be applying that the Just Transition Fund will be there for us, but there's no guarantee that that's in place, and there's no mechanism for us to apply for that directly.
Okay, if there's no other questions from Maggie, would you? Yeah, you can come in again.
Just a short question, thanks, Claire. One of the things we've kind of touched on it in passing, but I'm wondering, Jordan, could you just say a little bit more about the broader community benefit of getting our infrastructure right? Rail is one element of that, but what's because we've talked about businesses, we've talked about SMEs and others, and commuters, but in terms of community benefit, can you just expand on that?
So the thing that it comes down to is regeneration. Fraserburgh and Peterhead are regeneration priority areas to the Scottish Government, but that regeneration priority area covers the entire North East coast. It goes as far as Banff, and I think it actually goes as far as Buckie as well. Yeah. So when we're speaking about investment in communities, in attracting investment, improving infrastructure removes that sense of remoteness, which attracts investment, and the investment is what gets communities. So rather than there's kind of this backwards thing, the better infrastructure you've got, the more investment there is in the local area, which means the more facilities you've got, the less in the area, which actually means the less commuters there is. So by investing in transport, you're reducing the amount of people travelling, which again is beneficial for our carbon emissions, because there's less people travelling overall, because we've got more facilities locally. We've got say a cinema locally, we've got a hospital locally, and we don't need to go into the city to do that, because we've got rid of that sense of isolation that these communities suffer. I have a pet theory that Fraserburgh and Peterhead are some of the strongest pockets of Scots speakers in the country, and I have a pet theory that that's because these communities are so isolated, and they've never had the chance to mingle and to lose their accents. So we've held on to our accents compared to other folk around the country. So I think that's a good example. But we're talking about, like I said, modal shift, reducing frustration, reducing accidents, and investment locally keeps people local.
Okay,
Thank you. I'll now bring this session to an end. I'd like to thank the witnesses very much for appearing for us this morning, and I'll briefly suspend the meeting as we change over our panel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Gavina. Good morning to the panel. I'm going to stay with you, Fergus, if I may. We heard this morning around the just transition and the impact it's having or not having on the SME sector. We heard the phrase carrot and stick was raised several times by panellists. I was just, I was musing around the way that it's already been said that much of the Just Transitions Fund is allocated to financial transactions, and I wondered if there's a sense from your members if the way this money is being administered and in the form of finance, is it available to your members, to the SMEs, and also throw into that start-ups and third sector, because we did hear from them when we made our visit to Aberdeen just a couple of weeks ago. Fergus.
Yeah, I would say just for clarity, most of our members are SMEs, so this does reflect the Chamber's membership. Is the Just Transition Fund, readily available to them? I think the kind of experience to date, when you look at the Year 1 projects, for example, I think perhaps the government's approach there was going for kind of safe bet organisations that could then disperse the funding thereafter. So you saw Opportunity North East, James Hutton Institute, Robert Gordon University, Energy Transition Zone, ETZ, for example, given funding to take forward. I don't know, you might want to come to Mark on, I guess, the interest that has come from SMEs versus larger scale companies for kind of work on financial transactions. Certainly from our experience, our SME members haven't had any issues getting in the room with SNIB to explore the opportunities. So I think that's certainly positive. I think, and I know perhaps this is just the nature of the beast, really, is that startups, third sector, there will maybe be a requirement or a higher threshold to demonstrate that they are geared up to utilise public funds for a purpose through the Just Transition Fund. So you heard from Jordan Jack from the Campaign for North East Rail, for example. They were essentially a campaign group run by a very sophisticated bunch of volunteers, engineers and people with a real professional as well as extracurricular interest in reinstating railways. But at the same time, they didn't exist as a corporation. They couldn't handle the £250,000 that had been granted to them to deliver a feasibility study. So it fell to the Chamber of Commerce, it fell to ourselves to become essentially the fiscal sponsor for that project, which we're delighted to do. And it actually adds, I guess, the weight of the North East business community behind what is a very laudable project to reinstate rail to Peterhead and Fraserburgh. But yeah, perhaps there needs to be a mechanism built into the Just Transition Fund, which makes it more accessible for the likes of startups and to third sector organisations and campaign groups who, let's be frank here, whose aims and projects, which could do with the support, may be as valuable longer term to delivering that just transition as an established business who has a project that needs funding.
Thank you. If I come to you, Mark, just open that up slightly, Mark. I mean, one of the things we heard was